right, Darryl, quit talking. Well, if Darryl was the second speaker, y'all might be here at 2, 3 o'clock, you know? Oh, man. I'll tell you, I enjoy doing this. Darryl and I get to fool around. We have a good time with all this. Today, I thought I would talk about Civil War books and some of the authors I know and read, and give you an idea of things you could read. I'm recording this, Darryl, so don't touch that camera.
Don't touch that dime.
We'll start with the great man's book. This is Darryl's book about the 24th Virginia Cavalry. This is part of the Howard series. I think Mr. Howard did just every regiment from Virginia. He did a book about every single regiment. These books are part narrative about what they did and part roster. So you can go and see where your great-grandfather, if he was in the 24th Virginia Cav. I expect when Darryl did this, he had to go look through microfilm like there was no tomorrow.
That's why I got these glasses.
Now you can get online and do all this without ever leaving your couch. But back then, when Darryl and all the other guys did this, you had to go through microfilm and read. The closest place that you can find these is the Bassett Historic Center. They've got them all, I believe. I believe they have every single one of these regimental series books. In the back room, they have a war room in the back, and you can go and find every one of these regimental series at the Bassett Historical Center, not the library, the Historic Center across the road. The other thing they have there is they have the official records of the War of the Rebellion. Like we were talking about Palmer's report about riding with George Stone will be in the official records of the War of the Rebellion. Lincoln called it the War of the Rebellion, not the Civil War or the War between the states. There also are the Navy records of the War of the Rebellion. Every report that any officer did are in those books. Now, the Army one, I think it's 128 volumes, just to show you they are gigantic, big black books with gold writing. But I think Bassett has all them. A couple of years ago, they did a supplement where a lot of the historians found war records, and there's a supplement to the OR just to show you how bogged down in this you can get. But they are the reports from the men, both sides, that survived the war. They didn't get burned up in Richmond or whatever. Lunsford Lomax, who rode with Jeb Stuart, ends up being president of Virginia Tech. He was one of the guys that worked really hard to get all these reports together. So you can go to Bassett and you can spend the rest of your life in the back room of the Bassett Historic Center. Trust me, I've tried. But anyway, we'll start with Darryl. This is my book about Patrick County and the Civil War. My books are over here on the table if any of you'd like to purchase them. We have all kinds of things from murder to Civil War. This is Jay Sheeler. We were talking about Jay last week, I think. He was a medicine man and Bush Marshal. This is from the first encampment at the Jeb Stuart birthplace, and they fought as cavalry. Well, Jay galvanized. He dressed up like a Union cavalryman, and this is them actually fighting the battle out there at the birthplace. I made a few notes when I was talking to make sure I get this. I'm going to go through this and talk about some of the authors and give you ideas about books to read if you want to. There are a few I won't talk about. We're talking about Nathan Bedford Forrest. My buddy Brian Steele Wheels, who's retired now, was at UVA Wise and at Kennesaw State, wrote a great biography of Nathan Bedford Forrest, Battle from the Start. And one time I went on a tour with Brian. I will tell stories about these guys, and we ended up going for all Forrest fought. What we really did was that we ended up going to every catfish house in Tennessee. At night, we would stop and eat catfish every single night. A lot of people start off with a book. I think a lot of us started off with this one right here, the American Heritage Book of the Civil War, and written by Bruce Canton. And that's where a lot of historians started with this book. It amazes me talking to people. More modern is James McPherson's The Battle Cry of Freedom. If you're interested in this book, has a lot about slavery in it and how it affected things. If you're, this won the Pulitzer Prize. McPherson was a professor at Princeton. I think he's retired. I think James is still alive. And of course, one that if you're just interested, this is a little book by Robert Penn Warren, The Legacy of the Civil War, which is a really good book about how people thought about it. So it's amazing how many people started off with one of these three books, just friends I've known over the years. But I know this was one of the ones I started with, and I still got it. Well, there are two sides of this war. Did y'all know that? And if you're from a Southern persuasion, Shelby Foote's 3 volumes on the Civil War is always a great place to start. Shelby, of course, was a novel writer. He was in Ken Burns' The Civil War documentary as the voice of the Southern perspective. Shelby's books, I think we would say, are from the Southern perspective. He's an old Mississippi man. In the 1990s, I worked for Insteel over in Mount Airy. I did computers for Insteel for years and years, and they had a plant we bought out in Memphis, and I was out in Memphis, had a big old white van, had to stop at every Cracker Barrel between here and there and eat. And I had always heard that Foote was in the phone book, and that if you called him, he would talk to you. So in the mid-90s, I'm in Memphis, hauling all this computer stuff back to Mount Airy. I picked up the phone book, sure enough, Foote, Shelby. So I called him, and he answers the phone. Now, I don't know if this would be, what this would be like, but this is, if you're a Civil War guy and Shelby Foote answers the phone when you call him, you think you're in the presence of greatness, And I talked to him for about 10 or 15 minutes. I told him about what we were doing with the Jim Stewart and how much I enjoyed his books. He gets a lot of criticism because his books are not footnoted, so they call him Shelby No Footnotes. But his books are extremely well written. The criticism is, of course, that he doesn't document it that well. But there are 3 volumes, and if you want to get a kind of a Southern perspective of the war, Shelby is the place to begin. I believe you got one on the back there. You had one of Shelby's books back there. They're still in print. You can go up on C-SPAN and places and watch him talk about his books. After the Ken Burns thing, really made him a celebrity. And he lived a high life there for a long time because of Ken Burns. But he also wrote novels, like one is Shiloh. This is a fictional book. He was kind of a poor man's William Faulkner. He and Faulkner were both from Mississippi, and I think he thought of himself kind of as a poor man's Faulkner. But anyway, the night I talked to Shelby Foote on the phone in Memphis. Oops. Well, if you want a northern perspective of the war, Bruce Canton is where you go. Some of the greatest prose ever written about the war by Bruce Canton. He wrote multiple books about this stuff. When I was at Virginia Tech, the first book I ever read by Bruce was this little one here, Reflections. He was the editor of American Heritage magazine for years and years and years. Bud Robertson told me a story that he would research for about 8 or 9 months every year, and every summer he'd get a case of scotch, and he'd go up to his cabin, which I think was in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and he would write all summer. And Bud thought it was kind of interesting because some of the greatest prose ever written about the Civil War was probably written by a man who was drunker than a skunk. Okay. But that's Bruce Canton. Maybe that's what we should do, Darryl, is start drinking when we're But his books are amazing. The Stillness at Appomattox is one there. But if you want a northern perspective, Bruce Canton is your man. And some of the best written stuff. Gary Gallagher just edited 3 volumes that Bruce wrote and footnoted it and all that sort of thing. Came out in the last year or 2. A little closer to home, this is a very young Tom Perry, about 1990, talking to Bert Davis. This is the opening reception we had when we tried to raise money to save the Jeb Stewart birthplace. Bert lived over here on the mountain. He had a summer home up on overlooking Rock Castle Gorge. And if you got invited to that house, that was, I don't know if that'd be like a Muslim going to Mecca, but it was big stuff for me, I'll tell you that. And I got to know him very well. Of course, most of us who know about Jim Stewart, his book is the first one that we ever read. He was a very dapper fella. He'd been a newspaper man. He really knew how to write. He wrote books about the American Revolution. And you see there, good-looking dude, very tall, very slim. If you looked up Southern Gentleman in the dictionary, I think you'd see a picture of Bert Davis standing there beside you. But he wrote books about Robert E. Lee. He wrote books about Stonewall Jackson. And like I said, he lived here in Packard County in the summers especially. And he'd show up with stuff. You'd be at a historic society meeting, there'd be Bert Davis sitting in the back row. You can never get him to talk. He claimed he lost his marbles. That's what he used to tell me. I lost my marbles. I didn't believe that, but I could never talk him into coming and talking for me. One thing he did do was when we started raising money for the birthplace, every time he got a royalty check for this book, he would sign it over and mail it to us. And we got the royalty checks for The Last Cavalier, which came out in 1957, and he was still getting royalty checks for that book in the 1990s. So that tells you something. And of course, for me, this all started in '82 when I took Bud Robertson's class. Here we are goofing around up at Bassett at the Historic Center. He came down and helped us raise money for the birthplace. He came here and helped us raise money. He came to the Bassett Historic Center. Bud was a very short fellow. He's standing in a chair there, and he has just whispered something to me that I cannot repeat with ladies in the room. He also was the head of the Civil War Centennial. That's him with John Kennedy and him with Lyndon Johnson. When John Kennedy was assassinated, Bud and another guy went into the Library of Congress and looked up how they had done Lincoln's funeral. Because Mrs. Kennedy wanted her husband's funeral to be like Lincoln's. And they found in the catafalque, the thing that they set the coffin on down in the basement of the Capitol, and Bud was up all night doing that. Of course, his first book was The Stonewall Brigade, which he wrote as an undergrad, and probably his most famous book is this giant, big doorstop of a book from Stonewall Jackson. When I had him as a professor, he was working on A.P. Hill, and probably his most noted book is this one, Soldiers Blue and Gray, which is about life for the common man. If you know Bud did documentaries on PBS, Al Roanoke, he did a radio show every Friday for the local NPR radio station. And it was my great pleasure to have him as a professor for 4 classes. I will tell you that I did Civil War twice, but I had these other 2 classes that were called Representative Americans. And what you had to do is you had to teach the class one day. Now, that doesn't sound like that awful bad. I've been sitting here for a month now teaching classes to y'all. But have you ever tried to teach a class in front of Bud Robertson, knowing that if you don't do a good job, he will eviscerate you. You will just be a little puddle of water over here at the floor. He's done it. He's the most terrified I've ever been in my life. I've never been afraid to talk in public since, because if you survive that, you can survive anything. Bud's mentor was this guy, Bill Wiley, who was a professor at Emory in Atlanta. And he was Bud's graduate and doctoral. And he wrote these 2 books, Johnny Reb and Billy Yank, which are about life as for the common soldier. And if you're interested in what life for the common soldier, they still hold up very well. It's kind of like Bud's book, Soldiers Blue and Gray, except they're one for each. And Wiley was a very instrumental historian back in the 50s and 60s, kind of a contemporary of Douglas Southall Freeman. They've been writing about the same time. I'm not going to talk about Douglas Southall Freeman, but I will tell you, he wrote a biography of Robert E. Lee. He wrote a biography of George Washington. They both won the Pulitzer Prize. He wrote a book called Lee's Lieutenants, 3 books called Lee's Lieutenants, which is a history of the Army of Northern Virginia. And that's where all the historians I'm going to show you now started, with Douglas Southall Freeman. He was the editor of the Richmond paper. They said you could set your clock by him. He would come down Monument Avenue at exactly the same time every morning, and he would salute Robert E. Lee as he rode by. This is a friend of mine. This is Kent Masterson Brown. He's a lawyer up in Lexington, Kentucky. And I'm going to tell you about him and a couple of books. He's written a new book about George Gordon Meade, which bucks the trend. He goes into excruciating detail about how Meade's army was just wasted by the time Gettysburg was over, and there's no way he could really pursue Robert E. Lee. And he makes a strong case for it. You know, Lincoln wrote a letter where he was going to just go after Meade and put it in the desk and never send it. Lincoln would do that. He'd write a mean letter to you and they never mail it to you. And he did that to Meade because Meade had finally won the battle and run Robert E. Lee back over the Potomac River. Kent wrote a book about the retreat from Gettysburg, something we never talk about. And this is probably one of the best books ever written on that subject. He goes into detail about how Robert E. Lee gets back over the river and how for all the criticism that Jeb Stuart gets going to Gettysburg, he gets no credit for getting them back across the river. Stuart's cavalry screens the army in Northern Virginia, and I don't really know that they would have got back without Stuart doing that. So anyway, a couple of books from Kent. Like I said, he was I think he was a Washington Lee man. He went to law school at Washington Lee, and I've got to know him fairly well over the years. But his book on Meade and his book on the retreat are really, really good. This is John Kosky. John used to be the historian at the Museum of the Confederacy. He's retired now, but John wrote a great book about the in the interesting topic, the Confederate battle flag. Goes into the history of it and all the controversies surrounding it, and very, very middle of the road, no agenda. John tells it like it is, and he kind of looks like he ought to be a Jim Croce. Some of you might even remember who Jim Croce is. He also wrote a book about the Capital Navy, which was the naval squadron they had in Richmond. They had a ship named the Patrick Henry in this naval squadron. And John has helped me over the years. He was like the archivist, like I said, at the Museum of the Confederacy before it became the American Civil War Museum now. They moved it to Trevor. But anyway, if you're interested in the battle flag or something about the Navy, well, I put a lot of Navy books in here, Darrell, because I knew you were going to talk about it. And here is Gary Gallagher. Gary Gallagher, for years, was at Penn State and then at the University of Virginia. He started the Civil War Center that's at the University of Virginia today. He's written so many books, I couldn't even begin to talk about it. There's also, he does a class on the war that's you can take, and it's, oh gosh, I could get 20 hours or something on the war. It's pretty good. Gary every year would have a tour at UVA where they go out and pick one battlefield. Here's the Spotsylvania book. He'd invite, I don't know, 6 or 7 historians, and they'd all present papers, and they'd go out on the battlefield, and you could take a tour with them. And I put Spotsylvania up here because this is one of them. These are all published by the University of North Carolina Press, sitting there with your light blue hat on. Gary would do this for every year. They did the Wilderness, they did Spotsylvania, they do Antietam. Whatever battlefield they went and toured, they produce a book. And this book has got Robert E. L. Crick's article in it about Yellow Tavern, which is absolutely the best thing I have ever seen written of Jeb Stuart in the Valley of Yellow Tavern. And it's an essay in this book. This is Fighting for the Confederacy. Gary edited this. It's Edward Porter Alexander, who was an artilleryman under Longstreet. This is the best memoir I've ever read about the Army of Northern Virginia. He tells things like the last time he saw Jeb Stuart was under an apple tree at the church at Spotsylvania Courthouse. And Alexander will go into just great detail about everything relating to Longstreet, Gettysburg. He, of course, is the man if you've ever seen the Gettysburg movie, Longstreet rides up to him and calls him Porter. And he's wanting Porter to tell him it's time to go. And Porter is not a little hesitant to tell General Longstreet. He kind of feels like General Longstreet needs to tell them when to go, not have Porter tell him, but he's in that movie. The young man played him. So these are a couple of books that Gary has done. Gary's retired now from UVA, and Caroline Janey now runs the Civil War Center and teaches up there. And I don't really know Caroline, but Caroline is absolutely the best looking Civil War historian I've ever seen. She is just a beautiful young woman, and she's replaced Gary there. And she writes about the war too. Well, look at here, Darrell. Robert Kenneth Crick. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't care what anybody says, Robert K. Crick is the greatest Civil War historian I have ever known. He was the head historian at Fredericksburg at Spotsylvania Military Park for years. If Bob liked you, you were in. We were talking about Cedar Mountain. He wrote a book about the Battle of Cedar Mountain that is by far the best thing that's ever been written. And the first time I ever met Bob Crick, I bought this book and I walked up to him to get him to sign it. And he would engage you and he would say things, well, where did you go to school? And I said, well, Bob, I went to Virginia Tech. Oh, he said, look Virginia Tech up in the index of this book. So he signs it to me, and I go over, I'm just like a kid in a candy store, and I look it up, and it says Virginia Tech, page, 278, and I go to page 278, he's talking about James Lane, who's at this battle, and Bob had insulted Virginia Tech, saying something along the lines of, James Lane knew about human frailty he later taught at Virginia Tech. And so this is me and Bob's whole relationship, and still our relationship. How you doing, Bob? He insults Virginia Tech. He also wrote this book about Stonewall in the Valley campaign. He is absolutely the best on the battlefield I have ever seen. He's one of those guys who can tell you which sergeant was behind which tree, and what his wife's family's name was. I mean, he's just incredible, his knowledge. He's retired now. He's Robert Kenneth Crick, and he's written some of the best things that have ever been written on the Army of Northern Virginia. He's not known quite as well because he was a National Park Service historian, but those of us who have been on the battlefield with Bob Crick know who the boss really is. This is his son. This is Robert E. L. Crick, Robert E. Lee Crick. He just retired from the Richmond battlefield. He's written a 2-volume book on the Gaines Mill battle that he spent decades working on. If you give the Civil War Trust, the battlefield preservation people, money, they will give you one of Bobby's books. It's the only way you can get Bobby's book. It's not available, I don't think, on Amazon anywhere. He and his father are strong in the preservation of battlefields, and he did that so you would have to save the battlefield to get his book. He also did this book. He's another regimental. He's in the Spotsylvania book. This is about all the officers, staff officers in the Army of Northern Virginia. Jeb Stuart had the largest staff of any general in the Army of Northern Virginia. I know that because Bobby counted them all. Everybody on Longstreet, Jackson's, Stuart's staff is in this book. And here he is. I like to say he's a younger, skinnier version of his father. But he is a great, great historian in his own right. Just to show you, I got Bob Crick, who never leaves Fredericksburg. He actually came down here one time to help me raise money for the Jeb Stuart birthplace. And when I took him over to our house, this is back in the early 90s, we had a dog. It was an old butt. And he was a big old thing, black and white. And his name was Stonewall Jackson. And Bob, of course, just loves Stonewall Jackson. So I have a picture somewhere of Bob Crick smoking a cigar with my dog. Anyway, like I said, that's Bobby, who just retired. He don't look like he's old enough to retire, but he is. This is my good friend and arch nemesis, Chris Hartley. Chris and I have known each other since he was a wee little college boy in Chapel Hill. He has written a book on Stoneman's Raid. It's really the only really good book on Stoneman's Raid. He wrote a book about James B. Gordon in the 1st North Carolina. He wrote a book about his wife's grandfather in World War II. And this is his new book about D.H. Hill. Chris is a marketing guy for Blue Rhino gas. If you're down in Winston, you see Blue Rhino. Chris is the marketing guy for that. But he's done 2 or 3 books. And he and I have this running battle. If we're ever together, we just spend most of the day trying to insult the other. And for instance, Chris will tell you that while I pretend to be a Virginian, he was actually born in Virginia. He will actually, in this book, it's a known fact that I don't much like the athletic teams for the University of North Carolina, sorry. Love the libraries, don't much like the athletic teams. Well, Chris went to Carolina, and in his book, Stewart's Tar Heels, you go and look in the index, and which he knew I would go and do, looking for stuff, and there it says, Perry, comma, Tom, see also, University of North Carolina, admirer of. That tells you about me and Chris Hartman's relationship. Tuesday night, the Roanoke Roundtable is going to have Jared Marlowe from over here in Collinsville. He's going to be talking about Stoneman's raid to the Roanoke Roundtable. Lynchburg has a roundtable. If you're really into this, they meet first Tuesday and the first Wednesday of every month, I think, or the second one. But, oops, in the wrong button. But like I said, Jared's going to be talking about Danville and Martinsville. I posted about this a little bit yesterday. And we were talking about O.E. Pilson. O.E. Pilson mentored me, and so I tried to mentor these younger guys with what I know. So if you're interested in Jared, works with the Blue and Gray Education Association, and he's one of these young up-and-comers. This is my friend Eric Wittenberg. Eric Wittenberg passed away this summer of cancer. Eric was quite a cavalry historian. I will tell you, this is his book about Jeb Stuart going to Gettysburg. This is his book about Jeb Stuart retreating from Gettysburg. These are just some of his books. He's an expert on John Buford at Gettysburg, things like that. So people always ask me about Stuart and Gettysburg. Well, here they are. These are the two books you ought to read. Incredibly thorough. No one will ever write any better books, I don't think, about Jeb Stuart. Eric, like I said, was a lawyer up in Columbus, Ohio. He passed away this summer. He fought cancer for a very long time, and he was a big bear of a man. And you wouldn't think that he would be kind of a pro Jeb Stuart guy, but he was. He hated Phil Sheridan. I've never seen a Yankee that hated Phil Sheridan as much as Eric Wittenberg did. I don't know really where that comes from. But anyway, these are some of his books. But if you're interested in Jeb and Gettysburg, those are the two books to read. And, I'll miss old buddy. This is William C. Davis. Jack came to Virginia Tech and worked on the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies with Bud Robertson. Jack had been the editor at Civil War Times Illustrated for many, many years, the magazine. And he's written, one of his best books is about Jefferson Davis. But you'll see Jack there. Jack always a very dapper fellow, you know. And every time I see Jack, I'm reminded of that Warren Zevon song, The Werewolves of London. I saw a werewolf at Trader Riggs. His hair was perfect. Jack Davis. I've never seen him. His hair is not perfect. Jack also has written a book, if you're interested in the 51st Virginia. A lot of Patrick County boys are in the 51st Virginia. He's come out, this is one of his latest books about Gabriel Wharton, who commanded the 51st Virginia. It's all the letters between Wharton and his wife. And like I said, Jack has written so many things I couldn't begin to tell you about. But I always think about his hair was perfect. This is Craig Simons. Craig was a professor at the United States Naval Academy, and is an expert on all things Navy, especially Civil War and World War II. He also wrote a biography of Joe Johnston, which I'm sure this book just keeps retreating back through the bookstores. He wrote a book about Lincoln and his admirals, Lincoln and his generals. He wrote one about Patrick Clayton, Stonewall West. But he's also written an enormous amount about World War II, Admiral Nimitz, Battle of Midway, just some of the things that he's written about. But if you want a Navy guy in the Civil War, that's your man, Craig L. Simons, S-Y-M-O-D-S. And he is actually quite funny if you ever hear him talk. Go to a couple of guys who are just experts on one particular thing. And this is Scott Hardwick. Scott, for years, was a park ranger at Gettysburg. But what he wrote about was Antietam. He wrote these two books about Antietam. And ladies and gentlemen, they're that thick. Both of them are that big. They're enormous books. You could stop your car from rolling down the hill with these books. so big. But like I said, he is an absolute expert. He worked at Gettysburg, but he wrote about Antietam because I think there was a National Park Service rule that you couldn't write about the park you worked in. So Scott wrote about Antietam, just down the road from Gettysburg. And these are two of the best books. And I mean, we're talking about excruciating detail on something. This is not just some fun little book about somebody. This is the definitive books on the battle that I don't think you'll ever top. Here's another guy. This is A. Wilson Green. Will used to run Pamplin Park over near Petersburg. He has written on the Petersburg campaign. These are two of his books, again, gigantic, big, thick books on one particular battle. He also started off with Bob Crick at Fredericksburg all those years ago. Bob Crick mentored a lot of historians who are now very big in the Civil War field. But here are two books about Petersburg and Will Green. Some of these guys, of course, wrote their own books. Mark Twain published Ulysses S. Grant's memoir, considered to be one of the best, or the best, memoir of a guy in this war that was ever written. He wrote it while he was dying of throat cancer, and he was able to finish it and pretty much saved his family financially because of how much money he made. Mark Twain published that for him. James Longstreet wrote an autobiographical book about his life, and this book gets him in trouble because you were talking about it either. Longstreet does the unpardonable sin. He criticizes Robert E. Lee. He didn't do that because Jubal Early was watching. There's always this great story about everybody who picks up their pen to write about the Army of Northern Virginia always has the idea of Jubal Early peering over their shoulder. Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, the president and vice president of the Confederacy, wrote memoirs of their lives. And how do I put this gently? For as good as this is, these two are not. These are insomnia killers. If you need to go to sleep, just pick up either one of those two fellows' books and go to read, because they will put you to sleep. As long as these two had published books, I'll never have to worry about mine being the worst book you ever read. But it's this thing now, like I guess Kamala Harris is out on a big book tour with her book right now. These guys did the exact same thing. Jefferson Davis's wife wrote a book, he wrote a book. Her book is much better, I think, than his, but that's just a personal thing. But they all wrote books too. Now, there's been more books, I think, written about this fella. I think only Jesus has more books written about him than Abraham Lincoln probably does. It's unbelievable how many books have been written about Abraham Lincoln. And here is just a couple of them. Michael Burlingame has written some of the longest, biggest books about Abraham Lincoln that ever were. If you want just a one volume, David Herbert Donald's Lincoln is pretty good. Here's something that I believe in strongly. Everybody talks about Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. I don't think the Gettysburg Address is his best speech. I think his second inaugural is his best speech. And this book is just to show you how ridiculously detailed people get. This guy wrote a book about Lincoln's speech, his second inaugural, just to show you the books about Abraham Lincoln. Yes, sir.
So have you been to Ford's Theater? Ford's Theater
Oh, yeah.
has the books written on Lincoln stacked up on top of each other, and they like go up to the second floor. I remember they had them like glued in there like a statue.
Yeah, it's unbelievable how many books have been written about it.
Somebody did an article about how many books have been taken, the titles of books have been taken from Lincoln's second inaugural speech.
Yeah.
There's tons of titles.
And of course, the running joke in the Civil War community is if you want to sell a book, you put Lincoln and Gettysburg in the title, and that'll guarantee you a bestseller because those two things are what sell. But just to show you just a couple of books about Lincoln, but I really like the second inaugural as a speech myself. Most people talk about Gettysburg, but I think his second inaugural is his best speech. And oh my gosh, if you shoot Abraham Lincoln, you have almost as many books written about you as you do about him. I remember, this is Jim Bishop. He also wrote one about the day Kennedy was shot. I know this because my mother Bless her heart. I got books for Christmas. I didn't get toys. Once I hit about 7, 8, I got books. I got that for Christmas one year. I got the day Kennedy was shot for Christmas one year. My mother liked books. That's all I can tell you. Now, here's 2 books that have recently been published in the last decade about John Wilkes Booth and the assassination of Lincoln. Manhunt by James Swanson was an extremely popular book. Apple TV has actually made a miniseries on this book, where Edward Stanton is the kind of the main character chasing after John Wilkes Booth. American Brutus is a book that I think is probably as good a research book as I have ever read in my entire life. And it's about the same thing. They came out about the same time. Brutus kind of got overwhelmed by Manhunt because Swanson had better media contacts. But they're both very good books. But just to show you, those 2 books came out within the last decade, and one of them is an Apple TV show, and the other one is one of the best research books I have ever read in my entire life. Well, there's fiction, you know. The Killer Angels is, of course, the basis of the movie Gettysburg. Of course, we know, if you go by just how many people have seen it, Gone with the Wind is the biggest movie of all time, if you adjust it for inflation and all that kind of thing. And of course, a humongous book. I'll tell you a funny story about this. Right after they made this movie, I was up at near Leesburg at a cavalry conference reenactment, and some of the guys who had been cavalrymen in the movie were there. And Katie Couric's husband was a guy named Jay Monahan, the one who died of colon cancer. And he was there. Jay actually was a cavalry reenactor. He rode the horn. He wasn't just that, he was the guy who blew the horn. He was the bugler in this group. And so here comes Katie in, and she tells one of the guys, she asked one of the guys, she's kidding, I hope. She says to him, "Hey, y'all were in that movie, was that the Killer Bees?" I think she was kidding. I think she was kidding. But her husband was a great guy. He was a big lawyer in Washington. But on fun for weekends, he rode around and blew a horn riding a horse. And that's what he did. Of course, Walt Whitman famously said, "The real war will never get in the books." Well, Walt, you might not have been right about that for what we've been doing for the last 30 minutes here. But, you know, they made 2 of these. Michael Shara and his son then wrote Gods and Generals, and then he wrote a 3rd book. Oh gosh, what's the name of it? They never made the 3rd.
The Last Full Measure.
Yeah.
They've never made the 3rd movie. They've made the 2 from the Shara books. But, you know, Gone with the Wind, I think, is what most people think about when they think about the Civil War in fiction. And I think it's still the biggest movie of all time if you adjust it for inflation and all that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, these are just the books written about Jeb Stuart. Yeah. Burke's book here, The Last Cavalier. This is Blackford, who wrote with Jeb Stuart and ended up at Virginia Tech. He wrote a book. Eric Wittenberg's books right here. John Thomason's book about Jeb Stuart, written in the 30s. This is the romantic Jeb Stuart, if you're really into the romance of it all. Bob Trout, who's written all kinds of books that followed the plume. Jeffrey Wirt wrote a fairly recent biography of Jeb Stuart, which I think is very good. And Ed Longacre's the latest biography of Jeb Stuart. It's a little bit of a hatchet job, but you know, I might be a little biased. What can I say? But these are just books written about Jeb Stuart, just to give you an idea of, he's kind of a big deal. Here's some of my books that I have over here. We're talking about Jubal. I wrote a little book for the Jubal Early Home Place. Next Sunday, like I said, they're having a program out there. It's up near Boone's Mill. They've been working on that for about 30 years. They've restored the house.
What time
I
next?
think it's after lunch. I don't know exactly, but they're having a little Civil War Days thing up there. And if you have never been, I encourage you to go. This is the new book that if you read the Enterprise, these are the articles I write for the Enterprise, put into one book. And these are just some of my books I've done for the last 30 years now. Every week The Enterprise publishes Beverly's articles, which are about people in Patrick County. And the back page is usually one of my articles about Jeb Stuart of the Civil War. This is Beverly's book. We took the first 100 of her articles and put them in the book. This is Andrew Stedman, who was the first guy to publish the Enterprise. He called it the voice of the people. If you ever look at the headline of the Enterprise, it will say the Enterprise, the voice of the people since 1876. And that's your first publisher of the Enterprise. This is about Orlena Puckett and her cabin. They've recently put a new roof on that thing, so they finally are doing something up on the parkway. They just put more roof on Major Mill. Still need to dredge that pond. That pond looks awful. But anyway, there's your Enterprise history. This is something I haven't told anybody about. I'm getting ready to publish this book. We've got 10 noted historians, and it's a tribute to Bud Robertson. It's going to come out the first of the year, and I'm the publisher. This is my little book about him. But he started a Civil War center up at Virginia Tech. It's still going. They do a summer tour. They do a weekend in the spring. You can go and do that. But this is brand new. Will be out early next year about Dr. Robertson, which is what got me started in all of this all those years ago. And if any of you ever want to come to the Jeff Stewart birthplace and take a tour, I'd be happy to take you out there and walk you around and tell you about it. It's open dawn to dusk every day. There's 75 acres. There are trails that go all the way to the river and back. We have his great-grandfather's grave from the American Revolution there. And this, of course, is the sign that started it all for me when I was a little boy. My mother said I drove her insane, wanting to go out there and see what was out there. And she left me with Mr. and Mrs. Brown and created the monster you see before you right now. So I thank you for the last 4 weeks. I think Darrell thanks you. If you ever want to be friends with me on Facebook or follow me, here are the ways to do it. This is a book I published for a young man up in Bluefield about the 36th North Carolina Infantry. And it's won more awards than any book I've ever done, I promise you that. And anybody has any questions, I think me and Darrell will be happy to try to answer them. And I really appreciate y'all coming these 4 weeks. And that's the Civil War. Anybody?
Do you know if there's a resource for hearing, like the NPR show or the radio show that Dr. Robertson did? Is that archived anywhere?
I think you might still buy them. I think NPR sold those things for years. The Roanoke Public Radio sold those for years to raise money. I don't know if they still do that, but I know they used to do
I
that.
know he did I can't remember the name of the series, but he did a documentary series.
Yes, and those are all up on YouTube. You can go
those
up
are
on YouTube and watch them. But the radio broadcast, I think the public radio station used to sell them.
I used to listen to him when I was a kid.
Yeah, every Friday. He'd come on every Friday morning. And I got to be on one of those with him one time. But I'm in one of his documentaries too, up the war in Southwest Virginia.
Yeah.
He came down to the birthplace.
And the one he did on Appomattox was a great one too.
But, he didn't much like Ken Burns' series on the Civil War. And I think sometimes the reason he didn't like it is probably because he wasn't in it. But he did not like Ken Burns' thing, so he started making those documentaries himself. And Jack Davis is in a lot of those with him.
I heard him say at a lecture one time, the more you like Ken Burns' Civil War, the less you knew about it.
Yeah.
So,
He had a pretty strong
yeah,
opinion.
he did. He did.
I can't remember who. I heard Gary Gallagher talk about it one time, but he was talking about Henry Kidd Douglas that wrote the Stonewall. And I don't think Gallagher said it, he said another historian said, just speaking about these authors, I always thought it was very funny that he said that book should have been called Stonewall Rode With Me.
Yeah. That's how Kiros von Bork wrote a memoir about Jeb Stuart, and I've always thought it should be Jeb Stuart Rode With Me. Anything Civil War related.
Talk about that Tight Ranks book a little bit.
Tight Ranks is a regimental history that a young man up in Hazelwood wrote. He's a banker up in Bluefield, and it's just a regimental history because, the North Carolina regiments are in the big books. They're not as individual, like the Howard thing that you wrote. So he wrote this book. I think he had ancestors in the 36th North Carolina Infantry, and it's a pretty good thick book, but it's won a lot of awards, North Carolina historians and stuff. And he asked me to publish it for him, so I did. It used to have a very active Facebook page because people who were related to people in the regiment would ask Donald questions and stuff. Something I don't know very much about at all, but he did. He asked me to publish it for him, and I did.
What about your book on Early that you did?
I did that for my buddy Gerald Vai, who was instrumental in the Jubal Early home place thing. It's just a little short biography of Jubal. There it is, right there. Unreconstructed. Jubal, and the only place you really can get it is at the Jubal Early house. So I gave it to them to raise money for them. So if you go up next Sunday, they'll have them there for sale. But it's just a little biography of Jubal that I did to help them raise money. Mainly. It's not meant to be an in-depth Jubal Early biography. It's just kind of a starting place for you if you're interested in Jubal. Jubal's quite a character. He really is. Darryl, we could have a whole program on Jubal Early. I promise you we could easily. But I encourage you to go up there and visit his house on Sundays. It's usually open on Sunday afternoons. And it's a beautiful white frame house. Jubal, I don't know that Jubal was born there, but I do know he lived there for a very long time. And it's where he hid out when the war was first over. And he had to sneak away and go through the Union picket lines. Put on this old frock coat or something that the owner, one of the owners of one of the other houses would ride through every, and so they thought it was that other guy, and it's Jubal, and he gets away. But like I said, man liked his bourbon, the only man who cussed in Robert E. Lee to get away with it. But Jubal's important for another reason, and after the war, Jubal starts this thing called the Southern Historical Society. And they publish articles and their books. All those articles are bound, and they're at Bassett. I think they're at Bassett, where Jubal will argue with James Longstreet, and they will really go after Longstreet especially. He goes after Jeb Stuart at first, but Jeb Stuart's chief of staff was a guy named Henry McClellan. He was a cousin of George, but he was a Confederate. And Henry McClellan actually wrote Jubal Early a letter basically saying, okay, Jude, if you keep going after Jeb, we're coming after you. Because we know you at Gettysburg were not all that great either. And so Jubal then changes his tune a little bit and starts going after James Longstreet because H.B. McClellan warns him that John Mosby and the Stuart crowd are going to come after you. And you can read these letters. They're in the Virginia Historic Society up in Richmond. Jubal changes his tune, and he's very influential. That thing I said about no one ever picked up a pen to write about the war while Jubal Early was still alive and not worried about what Jubal was going to think or say about what you wrote. And he would come after you. And he really controlled the narrative for a very long time, up until about 1900 or so, let's say. There's a young lady who's a teacher at VCU, Shively. She was one of Gallagher's graduate students, is writing a biography of Jubal Early, which I'm really interested to see what she says about all of that. But anyway, so that's Jubal. Thank y'all very much. I stayed up watching Taylor Swift's team beat mine last night, so.
I told him he should have went to bed.
These blue books are souvenirs, y'all.